Hello, good afternoon. My name is Auma Tindi, and I am a doctoral intern at the Counseling Services. And today, our topic for the cut chat is sticks and stones. Words can hurt.
And I'm Lindsay Kubina with the Access Center.
So could you just take some time to introduce yourself to somebody you're sitting close to? And just tell them why you are interested in this topic. Just probably 2 minutes of introduction. Be the timekeeper. Okay. So I'm just going to ask a few questions and just let me know how you feel about the topic and what comes to your mind when you hear sticks and stones may break my bone, but words will never hurt me. What are your thoughts? What comes to your mind when you hear that?
I remember when I was little being told that a lot, especially like between me and my two younger brothers. And you go tell your parents like, so and so said this and this happened, and my parents' reaction was always, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And I'm like, except I'm sad. And little emotional Megan was like sad about a lot more simple things than college student Megan is, but it always annoyed me a lot.
Thank you. Would like to go next? Somebody else? Okay. Today we will discuss the language of ableism, just to let us get into what does it mean when we say words hurt. Although sometimes people think that when somebody beats you physically, that's when the person hurts you. So we are going to get into the ableist language.
So some of you may have not necessarily heard of the phrase ableism before. So just to start out just to kind of define the language for you that you're going to hear today, ableism refers to any type of discrimination that happens in favor of a person who is able-bodied or a person who does not have any type of disability, whether that be a visible or an invisible type of disability. It also includes, like I said, discrimination or prejudice against people with disabilities, in addition to maybe showing favoritism towards someone who does not have a disability. Ableism also includes the belief that people with disabilities need to be fixed or cannot function as full members of society. So sometimes when someone hears that another person has some type of a disability, they immediately jump to, well, what are ways that we can fix this or make this better, rather than how can we maybe alter the environment, for example, so that that person with disability has an equal access versus trying to change that person. It also includes the idea that having a disability is a defect or a problem, rather than disability being viewed as a dimension of difference or an aspect of diversity. So in the same way that you'll see diversity in religious beliefs, you'll see diversity in gender, you'll see diversity in race or ethnicity, there's also some diversity that you see within disability. And when people fail to acknowledge that, that can also be instances of ableism. Now, ableist language, as we get through this presentation, we'll talk about some examples of ableist language and then some alternatives to ableist language. But ableist language basically refers to any word or phrase that devalues people who have disabilities. So if you said, for example, that a person suffers from dyslexia, again, then you're giving this idea that the disability is a problem, that maybe they don't function very well, rather than just saying that the person maybe lives with a particular disability as a part of their everyday life. The reason that it's important to think about the language that you're using is because ableist language can be very oppressive to and marginalizing to people with disabilities. And as you'll see when we go through some of the examples, a lot of these things are just really said on the daily basis without people just really thinking about the impact that they might have on others around them. And so that's kind of why we wanted to bring this issue to the forefront of people's minds and to be kind of aware that the language that you use does have an impact on somebody, even if the person next to you doesn't mention it at the time. And throughout this presentation, if you have comments or questions, just definitely let us know, and we'll bring you the mic because we are recording this presentation in case other folks want to log on and watch it later. And then if anyone is zoomed in to watch this presentation, you won't be able to unmute yourself to ask questions, but you can put questions in the chat box and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. So I mentioned a little bit of why it's important to discuss ableism and ableist language. And one of the main things is, again, that disability is an aspect of diversity that needs to be acknowledged with all of these other areas that we more commonly think of. And language in general, whether it be ableist language or sexist language or homophobic language, should not ever be used to marginalize or oppress anyone. Ableist language makes people feel bad or unwelcome in certain situations, especially when you consider that not all disabilities are visible. So you might be saying something and you're like, well, nobody around me looks like they have a disability, so I can say whatever. But if you're talking about somebody that has maybe a psychological disability, for example, that you wouldn't notice by just looking at them, then that language can still be very hurtful to them. One example I have of this was actually given to me by a student I work with in our office who said that they had an instructor who always was saying, well, there's no dumb questions, which doesn't seem like the most harmful thing to say, but for this student, he had been regularly told by teachers and by peers that he was dumb because he had a learning disability, and so it was very off-putting to him to hear there are no dumb questions. It just really made him not want to speak up at all. Or there was another office on campus that was doing a monthly event that they would call Manic Monday. And that was very unwelcoming to a student that was part of that group who had bipolar disorder and would get told that they were acting manic. And so it was great when that student spoke up and mentioned that, because they just changed the name of the event to Magic Monday and still kept the spirit of the event, but didn't have language embedded in it that might potentially make certain people feel unwelcome. The other reason that it's important to consider this is, while it may not be relevant to you at this particular moment in your life, that it can still be hurtful to somebody that you love or somebody that you care about. And additionally, your ability status can change at any moment. You might be a person today that is not considered a person with a disability, and you may have an accident or you may have some other event in your life. Maybe you get a serious medical diagnosis, and then all of a sudden your ability status has changed. So that's another reason that it's important to keep the issue of the language that you're using in mind.
So Lindsay has touched on some things, why it is important to be sensitive to the type of language that you use. I would just like to emphasize that when you are using ableist language, and it's not just causing discomfort to the other person, but think about the psychological effects of the word or how you have devalued that person by using ableist language. So just to be mindful of that. We have a proverb in my country, I come from Kenya, that says that somebody would rather beat me with stones, but not with words. Because the words, somebody, I know if we could do a survey of you seated here, you would say, you know what, there were some words that were spoken probably when you're 5 years old that has stayed with you today. In the same way, if you use ableist language on somebody who is experiencing some form of disability, that is the same damage and psychological damage you are causing to that person. So college group that raises awareness about the use of language, and we are going to watch a short video of the college students raising awareness about ableist language. So it's important to keep in mind that many of the disabilities that people experience are not visible. Somebody could be having a disability, but you are not seeing it. Others could be having disabilities that you are able to see immediately. So just to be aware of that and be aware of using words that are hurtful or marginalizing or oppressive to other people. And sometimes the same goes for everybody. Always remember that we do not know people's personal situations. So unless you strike a conversation with the other person, you may not know what their personal situation is. Just like the video demonstrated, and I know you saw a varied or various forms of disabilities that people have, and the words that are commonly used that really marginalized and really are offensive, and not just marginalizing and offensive, but it's equally psychologically distressing. It's more of scarring, you're scarring the other person by using those words, because those words, the person will carry them for a very long time. So we saw some examples of ableist language as demonstrated by that college group of students. What are some examples of ableist language that you can think of?
And you can just say these aloud. I was going to write them on the board, but they took all the markers.
Yeah.
So we'll just remember what we said. Retarded. Yeah, that's a really good example.
Other examples that you can think of?
Yeah. When people call inanimate objects gay, for example, I'm not sure if that would fall in the category of ableist language, but definitely falls in the category of oppressive type of language to be using, for
and
sure.
exclusive. It's not a language that is inclusive. It is not a language that values diversity. It's like you're seeing the other person as different. So you give them that name, you are so gay.
Yeah. A couple other examples. Can you think of anything?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are really good examples. She had shared using comments about mental health issues in a very casual manner, such as saying that your OCD is acting up, or that your ADHD is acting up, and not realizing that some people very much struggle with that, or that, I need this way because I'm really OCD. Again, kind of minimizing what people who actually have that disorder are dealing with. So very good examples.
Have you heard people also talk of, oh, she's so bipolar or he's so bipolar? And can you imagine if somebody in that group is actually having a bipolar disease? It means that they are being excluded. It means that they are not part of the community. So using a language that is exclusive. Some of the languages that we hear, he's crazy. You heard that before? Anybody use that? Yeah.
It's okay.
It's okay. We use such words casually, Have you heard of, that is so lame? And yet we have people on wheelchairs, right? Was such, you gave an example, she's so OCD, or that song is retarded, or was such as, this chair is gimpy, or are you blind? Or things, that's the handicap door. So such words. So what are some of the alternative words that we can use? Just, for example, he's crazy. What could be language that is acceptable, language that is sensitive, language that is inclusive? He's crazy. High energy, yes. How about the weather is bipolar? whether it's sporadic or ever-changing or unpredictable, like the weathermen always give us unpredictable prediction about weather. How about that is lame? I dislike that show. That show is boring. How about she's so OCD? She's so particular. Very organized. How about that song is retarded? I don't like the song, right? Or confusing, or it is ridiculous. This chair is gimpy. It doesn't work, right? Go ahead. Are you blind? I do have glasses. Can you imagine somebody saying that where I am? Are you blind? What word could you use? An alternative word for that? Mm-hmm. Do you not understand? Can I clarify it? That is a more sensitive and inclusive language. That's the handicap, though. There's a door, yeah, it's a door, right?
That one's a
There's
little bit
the
trickier. It comes up
accessible
more in my
interest.
office, yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than saying handicap, saying accessible is a little
So
bit.
just see how we could find alternative words to this word, the other words that are so exclusive, that kind of categorizes people and marginalizes people. So we just have to train our brains and be sensitive about the words that we use to describe each other.
So another example of an ableist viewpoint that often includes ableist language is this idea that people with disabilities that are maybe just doing everyday things are very inspiring and brave just because they happen to do them with a disability. So ableism doesn't just come up in language, it also comes up in kind of some of these overall viewpoints. And this perspective was shared with me by one of my students who has cystic fibrosis, which just briefly is a disease that affects lung function and breathing, and then often digestive function as well. And she gets very frustrated when people find out that she has CF. They find out about what her medical regimen entails, her breathing treatments, and that sort of thing. And they say things like, wow, you are so courageous, or I could never take all of those medications. And she's just like, yeah, you would. If you had a chronic disease, you would. You would just do it. It's not, I'm not exceptionally courageous because I'm just doing what I need to do on the daily basis to survive. She would rather be recognized for an actual achievement, like publishing her research, for example, or getting into a graduate program, than just be recognized for taking her medication and doing her breathing exercises, which are just things that she has to do. And that's not to say that people with disabilities are not ever inspiring or brave, but this viewpoint is just very minimizing to those people. It doesn't really focus on the person, It just focuses on the disability. So when she's being told that she's so brave and courageous because she takes her medication, that's just focusing on the fact that she has CF and isn't focusing on anything else cool that she's doing, like traveling to another country to do research, for example. The other problem with viewpoints like this is it implies that having a disability is a bad thing and that living with it makes you exceptional, inspirational, or strong, when, like I said, many of the things that people with disabilities have to do is just things that they do, that they just do on the daily. They don't see it as being exceptional. It's just things that they have to do. This also objectifies people with disabilities because it implies that if you're able-bodied or neurotypical, meaning that you don't have anything maybe neurologically or psychologically wrong, that your life could be worse. So, you know, well, at least you don't have ADHD or something like that. It's just, it's again, very minimizing and negative with disabilities rather than, again, focusing on the person or focusing on the fact that there's other things that these people are doing and that having a disability isn't like the worst thing in the world. This is one of the memes that got really popular for a while that a couple of students in a student group I advised brought up because they were saying, you know, obviously it's great that this kid is running a race. He has this very cute look on his face. He's very, very proud of himself and what he's doing, but he's also just running in the only way that he knows how. So again, it's not really focusing on this kid and this kid being happy. It's just focusing on the fact that he has a disability and is running with prosthetic limbs. And so there was a bunch of these memes for a while that had the same phrase, but different people with disabilities doing different things. And again, it's perceived very negatively by many folks who actually have disabilities. This is a brief video clip I'll show you all that is a very good example of this. Stella Young was a disability advocate. She had osteogenesis imperfecta, which is also called brittle bone disease, and she was in a wheelchair for her entire life. And she gave a really excellent TED Talk that I would encourage you, if you have the 9 minutes or whatever TED Talks are, to watch. It's a really good one. But basically, this clip is showing where when she was 15 years old, someone in the community approached her parents about giving her a Community Achievement Award. And she and her parents agreed that this award was not suitable for her, and she will explain that in this clip that is from her talk, which is called "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." Whoops. There we go.
It's all very normal. And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me. I grew up in a very small country town in Victoria. I had a very normal, low-key kind of upbringing. Award. You know, I went to school, I hung out with my friends.
I think that I might have clicked it twice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's all very
okay.
normal. And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me for a Community Achievement Award. And my parents said, that's really nice, but there's kind of one glaring problem with that. She hasn't actually achieved anything. Yeah. And they were right, you know. I went to school, I got good marks, I had a very low-key after-school job in my mum's hairdressing salon, and I spent a lot of time watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek. Yeah, I know, what a contradiction. But they were right, you know, I wasn't doing anything that was out of the ordinary at all. I wasn't doing anything that could be considered an achievement if you took disability out of the equation. Years later,
Like I said, that's just a really good TED Talk kind of illustrating some of these points. And I liked how she mentioned, probably because of my age, that she was like, all I did was go to school and watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek. So again, if you took disability out of the equation for her, the only difference was that she did those things. She watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer while she was in a wheelchair. But at 15, other than that, she hadn't done much remarkable. Now, certainly she did go on to do very many remarkable things, but at the time that they were wanting to nominate her for the award, not really so much. So what are some examples of ableist language or behavior that you may have encountered now that you kind of know a little bit more about what that includes?
I feel like a lot of people casually use expressions like that they're OCD or stuff like that. And a lot of people I know are like, oh, I'm so anorexic, like when they don't eat enough food or whatever, it'll just like they're on a diet or something. And I feel like exaggerating it to that extent is harmful to people who do have those issues.
Yeah, that's very, very good point, for sure. Anybody else have any examples now that they kind of know what this all entails?
If you misread something and say, oh, I must be dyslexic, or even if you're speaking with someone and they misread and you say like, oh, what are you, dyslexic? And they actually are dyslexic.
Yeah, that can be very uncomfortable for that person because, again, you wouldn't be able to see dyslexia by looking at that person, but you're probably going to be making them feel very uncomfortable or maybe unwelcome in a situation by saying things like that. Any other examples that you all have? Okay, those are two very good ones. And a lot of it is just things that we don't necessarily think of. We think it feels, very innocuous, but I would suspect too that if you talked to somebody who was impacted by that, you'd probably hear a pretty different story.
So what can you do if you encounter ableist language?
I know my high school theater teacher was very upset by people using the word retarded casually, because like that's not okay, obviously. And so whenever she heard words like that, or we had a student in our school who was hearing impaired, and they didn't like being called hearing impaired because they're not hearing impaired, they're deaf. And so whenever we discuss things like being unaware that they didn't like being called hearing impaired, our teacher was very good about saying, hey, let's not use retarded. Or how about instead you say deaf, because they're not impaired, they just can't hear.
So
Yeah.
speaking up. Any other examples, or what you can do personally would also be a good way of looking at it?
You could simply just say it's not very nice to use someone's handicap or disability as a way to describe something that is inadequate or inanimate or not even comparable to a person.
Good point too.
One more. Somebody who has not talked. Thank you.
Saying like using somebody's handicapped as a joke, like saying, "Oh, this song's so retarded," like you're making a joke of that disability, so that's not okay.
So I hear all of you say that don't be a bystander when you hear somebody use ableist language. And what you've heard today about the long-term effect that using ableist language can have on a person would definitely make you do some of the things that you have identified. Remembering that it's not just uncomfortable, to use ableist language. It is not just exclusive, but excluding the other person, but it does more than that. It causes psychological damage to the other person. And always, when you know that something is wrong and you are silent or you turn the other way, Martin Luther King says that silence is equally injustice. So think about that. When you are silent and you witness, you hear, or you even use ableist language, you'll still be part of the injustice. So there are just a few things that you might do in addition to the examples that you have just provided. Don't be a bystander. I heard that very clearly, that speak up and not just wait for the person who is being marginalized to speak up. Shut it down. Tell people that it's not okay to use that kind of language. Ask them to explain what they mean. And I think sometimes we don't reach out in that way. We just assume. So if you could reach out and ask for an explanation, it's starting a conversation or entering into a dialogue with somebody else. Be honest. If you don't know, ask. Sometimes I've seen it, you run to hold the door for somebody because they're in a wheelchair, but they will show you, no, I'm fine. I can go through this door. Instead of that, you could ask, do you need help? If they say yes, you can help. If they say no, you respect that. Make a face, just if you can, whatever you want to do, like the college students, they were passing information. They were doing the work of advocacy, letting the campus community know that, yes, this is going on, and we need to do something to stop it. Use of sarcasm, I don't know that. I don't like that. So how might it make you feel to stand up to someone about this issue? A point of reflection. What are your fears? What are your reservations about confronting someone about ableist language?
I feel like sometimes it can be sort of socially uncomfortable to be the one that like makes a big deal out of something, especially if the whole group is just going along with it. But at the same time, it's worth it, especially if there's someone else in the group that you're kind of standing up on the behalf of, like because they are actually suffering from something and they don't want to make a big deal out of it. So it's the right thing to do. But probably like the reservations would be just like being worried other people might think you're like stuck up about something or whatever, but it's still the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And one suggestion for that might be then too, if it's kind of in a larger crowd and you're not comfortable just shutting somebody down in front of everybody else, is maybe talking to them to the side later or afterwards. Just so then too, it's not maybe putting them in an uncomfortable position, it's not putting you in an uncomfortable position. But yeah, like you said, it may be worth it in the long run if somebody feels more comfortable being part of a group when they know they aren't going to have to hear that language from the group.
Any other suggestions? We have 5 minutes for questions, clarification, comments, suggestions.
When you guys said earlier that people don't like to be called out as being brave or inspirational when they have a disability, how would you recommend responding to that? Like if someone says to you, like, "Oh, I have X disability," like should you show sympathy or something like that? Because I would imagine it is difficult to live with it, but you at the same time don't want to like make a huge deal out of it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that in those cases, some of it might depend on the context in which they share that information, because maybe if they are having a really rough day with their disability, so a health condition, for example, I'm type 1 diabetic, and every once in a while I just have a day where like my blood sugars are horrible, and I'll say something to one of my friends about it. And then in that case, maybe I am looking for a little bit of sympathy where it's just like, yeah, that sounds like it sucks. It's probably been a long day, that kind of thing. If somebody's just disclosing it to you, you know, in some cases too, if you feel like it's an appropriate context or you're just getting to know somebody for the first time, you know, you could even say something about, oh, you know, what's that like? Just to sort of get a feel for, are they sharing this just because they want you to know? Are they needing some sympathy? Do they want to talk more about it because they feel like people don't know much about their particular disability? So it might be just sort of feeling out the situation in which they make that particular disclosure. In my job, I hear those disclosures all day long because if a student comes into our office and is wanting to set up classroom accommodations due to a disability, you know, then it's not typically, well, they tell me their disability and I'm just like, oh, that's really sorry, I'm sorry, you know, that must be awful, so on and so forth. I mean, it's a little bit more solution focused in what I'm doing. So we're saying, okay, so you have this going on. What do you think might be helpful for you in the classroom? What might be helpful for you during testing, for example? And so it's more focused on things that would be useful and not other sorts of issues or finding out a ton of details and that kind of thing. But in some cases, I do have to ask more questions about, okay, so you've said that you have this, so tell me a little bit more about how that impacts you in an academic setting, for example. So I think some of that's going to be situational, but good question for sure.
So and to add on to that, is it that you are just focusing on the disability or you're looking at the person as a whole person? So when you think of this is an inspirational story, are you just on one part of that story, or because people, we have stories, each one of us, so it depends on how you approach it. And like Lindsay has said, get into a conversation with somebody. Let the person be a person. Let them be human. That is more important, and it's more of accepting other than just, okay, I'm going to take this part where they have done well, and this is going to be my inspiration. How about this person here, the whole human being? Any other questions?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
We can take one more because we're right on the dot. One more question.
How do we see if we have, oh, okay, good deal. So, well, thank you all for attending.